morning. I am Daniel Batlle, an Adjunct Fellow at Hudson Institute. And today we have two distinguished guests to discuss President Lula's leadership of Brazil. Marcio Coimbra is chairman of the Foundation for Economic Freedom in Brasilia, as well as vice president of ABRIG, the Brazilian Association for Government Relations. He has served in high-ranking roles in the Brazilian Senate and in APEX, Brazil's trade and development agency. Matthew Taylor is professor of international relations at American University's School of International Service and is author of several books on Brazil and Latin America, including his 2022 book, Brazilian Politics on Trial, Corruption and Reform Under Democracy. Matthew, so much has happened in the short time since Lula took office. It's easy to lose sight of some of the tumultuous events of the last few years that brought Brazil to where it is today. Can you provide our viewers a sense of how Brazil got to this point and what led to President Lula getting another opportunity to govern Brazil?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much, Daniel, for the invitation to be here and to the Hudson Institute. It's wonderful to have a chance to talk about Brazil and Brazil's prospects under the Lula administration. This is a huge question. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version, but there's a lot to cover. Our viewers will probably know that for 13 years, from 2003 to 2016, Brazil was governed by the Workers' Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, PT, first under President Lula, and then under his handpicked successor, Dilma Rousseff. They were, I think, by all accounts, extremely successful. They were helped along by the tailwinds from the commodities boom, the discovery of major offshore oil deposits. And so when Lula left office after two terms, he left with an approval rating of more than 80% and was able to elect his successor, Dilma Rousseff. Rousseff herself made a name by expanding social programs, expanding the state's role in the economy, and passing some important anti-corruption legislation. The issue, though, was that by midway through her first term, growth had begun to flag, political dissatisfaction climbed, and the ebbing tide revealed some fairly dire corruption within the Lula and Dilma administrations. And so as a consequence, for most of the past decade, Brazil has been mired in an intertwined three-pronged crisis, an economic crisis, a rule of law crisis, and a political crisis. The crisis really set off with street protests in June of 2013, and then it became layered over with the corruption investigations that are known in Brazil as Lava Jato. In English, we often call these the car wash investigations. And it turned into a rippling crisis of popular discontent with multiple demonstrations in multiple cities against the political system over the course of nearly 7 years until the pandemic hit. And so in many ways, the pandemic was the only good reason for these demonstrations to begin to dissipate. The protests and the pressures that were put on the political system by the Lava Jato investigations, especially between 2014 and 2016, contributed to what I think of as a mutiny of sorts within the legislative coalition that supported Dilma Rousseff. Many of the members of her congressional coalition were justifiably afraid of ending up in prosecutors' crosshairs. Many of them felt that she was doing too little to curb the anti-corruption crusade. And this contributed to her impeachment in 2016. It put an end to 13 years of PT government, and she was replaced by her one-time ally and vice president, Michel Temer. Temer himself started off on a positive note, but was so weak and beset by corruption allegations within his first year in office that he was a lame duck for much of the 2 years that he spent in the presidency. And as our viewers will probably know, Lula himself was jailed for nearly 20 months, allegedly for receiving a beachfront condo as a gift from a construction firm that had ties to the state. So he was jailed in April 2018. which under the terms of a law that ironically he himself had enacted, barred those with criminal convictions on appeal from office. And so this knocked him out of the 2018 presidential race, and Bolsonaro ran away with the election against Fernando Haddad, now the finance minister, but at the time Lula's stand-in. And there were a lot of stories behind Bolsonaro's rise. I think most people would agree that it was a set of coincidences that was so unique that it would be hard to replicate that victory, including an assassination attempt against Bolsonaro that threw him off of the debate stage and allowed him to gain the sympathy of some voters. So Bolsonaro began his term in this very unusual upset election. After this upset election, he began his term with essentially a three-pronged platform. Anti-corruption, he hired the judge who had led car wash as his justice minister. Pro-market, he hired a pro-market finance minister, Paulo Guedes, and also socially conservative. And he was supported by evangelicals who may have made the most important difference in his election. But as Bolsonaro faced corruption allegations of his own, and particularly corruption allegations against his family, and he also failed to invest in pushing forward some of the economic platform that Guedes had advocated, he increasingly grew distant from Congress and ultimately began to lose support from across the three-pronged coalition, essentially leaving him only with socially conservative voters in his camp. So this was a group of voters that were extremely religious, gun rights oriented, family values oriented, but in some cases even anti-democratic. And one consequence of this abandonment was that Bolsonaro became invulnerable to impeachment himself and essentially became a hostage of the forces within Congress that are known in Brazil as the Centrão, the big center. These are the center-right and center parties that have controlled Congress for much of the past 35 years. These are parties that are often more mercenary than they are ideological. They tend to trade pork for policy concessions to the executive branch. And they used their leverage over Bolsonaro to extract a variety of concessions, such as a so-called secret budget of very costly budget amendments that they could direct to their home districts. So Bolsonaro was not particularly adept at managing Congress. He also got into verbal battles with the Supreme Court. He followed the anti-vaxxer platform during the pandemic and generally, earned the enmity of a lot of Brazilians because of his anti-democratic, pro-military regime rhetoric. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court decided to change its interpretation of the law, which had allowed anyone convicted on appeal to be jailed. And with this decision, Lula was released from jail after 580 days in prison. 3 years later, the Supreme Court also annulled his convictions because of abuses by the trial court judge who had heard his cases. So Lula was free to run for president this time around, and this set up a showdown with Bolsonaro, Lula versus Bolsonaro. Hard to think of two polar opposites that were more polar than these two. Bolsonaro lost the second round of the elections in October, more handily than many expected, but by less than 2 percentage points. Many at the time were concerned that he wouldn't relinquish office, and he made many feints and starts that kept people on the edge of their seats until he finally left the country and went to Florida at the end of December, saying he wouldn't participate in the transfer of power at the inauguration. So democracy appeared to have survived when Lula was inaugurated on January 1st with a very narrow mandate. But as we all know, on January 8th, Brazil had its own version of the January 6th attacks. And Brasilia was rocked by demonstrations. Maybe Marcio was there at the time, I don't know. But Brasilia was rocked by demonstrations that turned violent. Protesters ransacked the Supreme Court, entered the executive branch palace, and also Congress. And the police and the military, and particularly the police from the federal district, did very little to curb these attacks. The big difference with the United States and the attacks that happened here on January 6th, of course, is that there was no vote count ongoing at the time of the demonstrations. But the ransackers' hope seems to have been that they might trigger a military intervention. That intervention never came, thankfully. And I think one of the unintended consequences of this is it did firm up support for Lula, at least initially. We have to remember that Lula was narrowly elected. He was by no means a beloved candidate, even among those who preferred him over Bolsonaro. So that's sort of the Cliff Notes summary. It's hard to really sum up all of the many complex threads of the past few years, but they have not spelled the end of Brazil's 40-year-old democracy, despite highlighting all of the challenges that democracy has faced over the past decade.
Thank you, Matthew. Great summary. Marcio, I would like your perspective on how the Lula administration has handled the challenges that Matthew outlined during its first 7 months in office. What is your assessment of Lula's presidency so far?
Thank you, Daniel. First of all, thank you for the invitation, for being here. Thanks for the Hudson Institute, and thank you to Matthew, who has a terrific job summarizing and analyzing Brazil, especially today for all of us. Here in Brasilia, Lula won by a very narrow margin, like Matthew said. So he didn't have a clear mandate. So he was challenged by many of Bolsonaro's voters. And many of them, after the election and before the inauguration, they settled around army bases in Brazil, asking for a military coup in the country, saying that we didn't have any clear elections, clean elections in Brazil, and that the election has been manipulated. Not has been proven on that matter. And all those people gathered on January 8th to try to initiate a military coup in Brazil. So they were not very well succeeded into that. And more than 1,500 people were jailed after this demonstration in front of Congress, invading Congress, the Supreme Court, and Palácio do Planalto, that's our executive branch. So imagine in DC, if you had an invasion in Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court. That's what happened in Brazil on January 8th. So it was something very big and very important for our country, since our democracy was at risk at that time. And but fortunately not happened, and we didn't have a coup at that time. And Brazil followed the next days trying to recover from that time. Now we have legislative investigation on that day on what happened in the district level here in Brasilia and the federal level in our Congress. Besides that, on our federal police and the Supreme Court are also investigated what happened on January 8th, trying to find who was behind all this organization. We had also some terrorist attempts in our country on the days before on the airport in Brasilia. So it was very difficult on those days because nobody in Brazil knew what was going to happen, if Bolsonaro was going to push for a coup with the military, or if the military was going to do any kind of movement. And nobody was really sure if Lula was gonna be inaugurated. But fortunately, not happened, and democracy prevailed, and the country now has a new leadership. And this new leadership, since Lula took office, had the first challenge with the January 8th attacks in Brasilia. So this was the first thing that this government faced. And I think it was a big step for a government that was just inaugurated, and for somebody who has won by a little margin over 2%, like Matthew highlighted in his first comments. And after that, Lula started to focus first on the international level. So he's been traveling a lot around the world, trying to restate Brazil and a different level that was left by Bolsonaro, who was a president who was never well liked in Europe and Western democracies, especially because he took some many actions in the government that were not well seen in an international arena. So this was the first step that Lula took, was the international trips trying to reinstate Brazil in the international community. So first step. Second step, it was the economy. So Fernando Haddad, who ran for president against Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, took the economy ministry. So many people thought that the PT was not going to be fiscal responsible and during his Lula's term now, because the PT, the Workers' Party, had never showed very much indeed respect to fiscal responsibility. Because this government and some other PT governments always overspent a lot in the past. So people were really concerned about what would happen. But if we look to Fernando Haddad's past work, like the mayor of São Paulo, we've seen somebody who was very centered, who would respect a really well-balanced budget and would do a good job in the Ministry of Economy. So he was not well seen at first by markets, but now that he passed the tax reform, that he passed a spending cap, so he showed that he is a fiscal responsible guy, and markets now are changing their perspective on Lula's government, on the economy. So I think for the first months of the Brazilian government, Lula's government, I would say that we faced the challenge of having a democracy questioned by half of the people. After the election, we had the challenge of placing Brazil back in an international community, and we had the economic crisis after the pandemic as something that was really also a big challenge for this government. And I see these as the 3 points that we see as the main challenges and the main work that Lula has done in the first 6 months.
Thank you, Marcio. One of the ways that one of the results of the Bolsonaro administration has been a recent court ruling barring Jair Bolsonaro from running for office until 2030. What does this mean for Bolsonaro's future and for the future of his movement?
I believe that Bolsonaro is not a player anymore as a political character for the 2026 election, but there are so many people on the right wing that are not in just like Bolsonaro, but people that are really nowadays much more moderate than Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is a very much of a radical, and he uses that as a strategy to gain votes and to gain support. But the other figures that we have on the right wing and the center right of Brazil are more moderate politicians. And I believe that Bolsonaro not being a candidate in the 2026 election, I think it opens up a high possibility for the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, who now during the tax reform discussions discussed with Bolsonaro, they collided their visions. Tarcísio de Freitas saying that the tax reform was important, Bolsonaro saying that the tax reform should be rejected, and Bolsonaro was defeated by Congress. And so Tarcísio de Freitas is looking like the best name on the right now to run in 2026. But nevertheless, we have Lula with a possibility of re-election 2026, and looks like Tarcísio de Freitas will wait until 2030 to run for president if he does. So there are some other names like the governor of Minas Gerais, Romeu Zema, the governor of Rio Grande do Sul, Eduardo Leite. There are many names in the political spectrum that could run in 2026. And we believe that Bolsonaro not being part of the ticket in 2026 is going to move things around. But there is another thing that we should keep in mind. The control of the federal budget and the federal government is seminal. It's very important for somebody who's running for election and especially for the re-election. Bolsonaro was very unpopular in the country. He was not popular. He had 65% of rejection 6 months before the election. And even though he just lost by 2%, because he used federal money, the government money, in order to promote himself, in order to get reelected. So I believe that if Lula is in control of the federal budget, and if Fernando Haddad is balancing the budget now, they will have money to push Lula forward in 2026, and maybe he will be an unbeatable candidate because he will have so much power as the guy who controls the federal government in 2026. So we have to wait and see, but the sitting president in Brazil has always an advantage going against people who are running against them.
Matthew, one of President Lula's objectives on the economic front has been to revive industrialization in Brazil after a lengthy period in which Brazil has been losing its industrial capacity. Do you view reindustrialization as a realistic goal, or are there other opportunities for growth that Lula should be focused on?
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll touch on some of the same points that Marcio made, but just, broaden your question a little bit beyond industrialization, because I think we can only think about industrialization within the context of sort of the broader economic policy preferences of the PT. Beginning with your question, the PT has always been very much a pro-industrial party. I think it's important to recall that the PT has its origins in the industrial heartland of Sao Paulo, of course, not on the side of capital, but on the side of labor. But that being said, these industrial roots are very strong within the party. They haven't faded much, especially even though agriculture's share of the economy has expanded enormously over the course of this century. Even though industry, the share of industry within GDP has more than halved since the return to democracy, from about 45% of GDP to about 22%, according to the World Bank. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the PT and PT governments, whether it was Lula 1, Lula 2, or Dilma 1, or especially Dilma 2, all of these governments have been torn between the kind of economic pragmatists and the hardcore developmentalists, the people who believe that a very forceful, muscular industrial policy is important to development. And we're beginning to see, I think, some of this again in the Lula administration. In the first and second Lula administrations, he had very pragmatic finance ministers, somewhat like Haddad. And then he also had ministers who were much more developmentalist, pro-industrial policy, very strong advocates for the role of the state. So we're seeing a little bit of that again, I'd say to a lesser degree than in his first and second administrations. You have pragmatists. The vice president, Geraldo Alckmin, is the Minister of Development, Industry, Commerce, and Services. Haddad, as Marcio has pointed out, in the finance ministry is sort of taking the pragmatic, moderate route. But there are these elements within the PT that are very pro-industrial policy, and they command state-owned enterprises. Most importantly, they command the BNDES, the National Development Bank. Aloysio Mercadante, the president of the BNDES, was one of Dilma Rousseff's most important advisors as she was undertaking a massive industrial development plan. And he is very much a dyed-in-the-wool industrial policy geek. Under Mercadante, this year, the BNDES announced a variety of new financing opportunities for industry. These include subsidized export credits, subsidized innovation and technology credits as well. And I think Lula, as he did in his first time in office, is really playing a little bit of both sides. He made waves in June with a tax incentive package for the production of popular, what are known in Brazil as popular cars, low-cost cars, the sort of the lowest value cars. And then again, last week, he called for subsidies to the manufacturers of white goods, of appliances. It's also very likely that the government will push for a much bigger industrial policy program for what they're calling a green energy transition. And this, we don't really know many of the details, but this has been hinted at by a variety of government sources. It would certainly include things that have been dear to industrial policy advocates in the past, like biodiesel, perhaps more hydroelectric dams. The new element here is probably some wind energy as well. Meanwhile, Lula has also talked about watering down the privatization of Eletrobras, the big electric company that was privatized under the previous government. The Attorney General under Lula asked the STF to reject a portion of the privatization bill that allowed for the privatization of Eletrobras. This was a bill that essentially took away some of the control that the federal government had, the federal government's majority vote. And so you could imagine that the STF might actually vote in the Lula government's favor. And that would return majority control to the federal government. I think, though, that it's important to also remember that this is all part of a broader stance that Lula is taking, in part, I think, conscientiously early in his term to provide some red meat to his supporters on the left. And we have to think about this in the context also of his calls for the end to tight monetary policies, his promises to look into revoking central bank independence. He also has proposed a debt renegotiation program for small debtors that I think plays to the electorate, but also plays to the left. And he signaled some weakening of regulatory agencies, as well as a watering down of rules that he's already undertaken on the politicization of the directorships of state-owned enterprises. And this was done in part to allow Mercadante to take over the BNDES. The law had prohibited politicians from running state-owned enterprises. But I think it's important to keep in mind that by allowing Mercadante to take over the BNDES, by changing the rules here, he's also opened the door to a repoliticization of the state-owned enterprises that had been barred in the wake of the Lava Jato investigations to get politicians out of state-owned enterprises. So you can see here that there's an element both of economic policy preferences, but also of trying to find a balance between the more pragmatist and the more developmentalist members of his administration, as well as a political effort to really throw some red meat to the left. At the same time, though, Lula is the essential politician. He is very good at the same time that he throws red meat to his base at throwing some red meat to Faria Lima, the equivalent of Wall Street. And we have seen some really important movements in this direction. Marcio mentioned the tax reform, and I'm sure he'll want to talk more about that. But Lula has also changed the fiscal framework that was in place to allow a little bit more spending, but at the same time kept some elements of fiscal responsibility so that investors aren't completely scared away. We just had the news this morning that Fitch has upgraded Brazil one step closer to investment grade. It's still 2 steps away from investment grade, according to Fitch, but you can see that this very pragmatic approach to economic policy serves Lula well. So I'll wrap it up there. We could talk a lot about a lot of these issues, especially the always pressing fiscal issue in Brazil. But for now, I think Lula has managed to triangulate in a very masterful way.
Thank you, Matthew. And I do want to follow up on tax reform. Marcio, tax reform is something that has eluded previous governments. Can you talk about what is in the tax reform package that is moving forward now and why it is so badly needed?
Oh, yes, this is very important. And this was made by the possibility and the master of politics that Lula is. In the Brazilian politics, he always manages to triangulate, throwing red meat, like Matthew said, to different parts of the political spectrum, the market, the PT base, and some other parts of the Brazilian scenario, especially Congress. And he managed to pass a reform that was needed and discussed in this country for over 30 years. And so he scored that in the first 6 months of his government. So this is a big achievement for him and for his government now in Brazil. Because even though Bolsonaro had a very much more of a pro-market market approach, he didn't deliver that much. It had much more of a base that would follow free market, a ministry that would talk about free market, but they were not able to privatize a lot like they promised. They privatized just a little. They didn't manage to have a balanced budget. And even though they had a spending cap, they didn't follow that over the years, especially because of the pandemic. So the tax reform was really needed and important. Our tax reform is good. No, it's not. But it's much better than what we had, because what we had was a disaster. And what we had in the past, it's gonna stay in a transition for 10 years. And I think that is really important. We have a transition until 2033, until we have the whole reform implemented in Brazil. And we have a lot of side laws that need to be approved for this tax reform. So Brazil is going to be much better, because our system in the back was not good. But it's not an ideal tax reform for Brazil. It's far from being a tax reform that was needed in the country. But we are in a democracy, and it's good that it's like that, because different parts of the countries, they discuss, they have different results, different approaches, and we see that we reached something that it's not good for everybody, but it's good for different parts of the country, and especially for taxpayers, because it made the system much more understandable for the people. So we have now tax that are not in the origin, but on the destiny. And we're gonna have the federal government and the state's government discussing together the amount of tax that is going to be charged in a council. So we have made progress in Brazil, but it's far away from what the country needs right now. But like I said, it was 30 years of discussion. And on the political side, we have something that's really important at this time. We had the chairman of the House of Representatives, Arthur Lira, the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, and President Lula, and now I'm referring for the government, and Fernando Haddad, as people that managed to stay together and tried to find a common ground. So we had the left, we had the center, and we had the right acting together to find a way with a solution for our country. And I think that's really important. And I think that is the big step that legitimates our new law, because it's a law that was discussed with the right, with the center, and with the left, with the executive branch, with São Paulo's governor, and with the chairman of the House, Arthur Lira, who is a very important man in our political spectrum right now.
Thank you. I want to turn to Brazil's role in global affairs. Lula's first months in office were marked by several statements and gestures that antagonized the United States and many other allies. He repeated Russian talking points on Ukraine, defended and embraced Nicolás Maduro, has advocated for other countries to abandon the US dollar. And his position seems to go beyond non-alignment and in the direction of closer relations with China and Russia. Matthew, what is behind Lula's apparent hostility to the United States?
That's a very provocative question there, Daniel. I'm not sure I would say it's hostility to the United States. I think it certainly is non-alignment and maybe even alignment to the interests of countries that are hostile to the United States. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that Brazil is hostile to the United States. despite all of the issues that you pointed out with Venezuela, with Russia, with a really massive delegation that went to China. And all of this is very disagreeable here in Washington, but I think we have to take it within a larger context, or place it within a larger context. What's behind this? I think at the end of the day, it's some combination of political contingency, throwing some red meat to his supporters on the left. His party, which, like many Latin American leftist parties, has a relatively strong anti-American bent, a suspicion of the United States, a suspicion of our commitment to many of the things that we claim to hold dear. I think that there is good reason for Lula to have been ambivalent about the United States on personal grounds. There is a feeling among much of the left that the United States played some role, and we can debate how much of a role, but played some role in the Lava Jato operation. I myself don't, put much weight behind those allegations, but I think that we have to take to heart that some members of the Brazilian left do believe that there were links between the Department of Justice and Sergio Moro and the prosecutors in Lava Jato. But then I think much more compelling than either of those two reasons is a long tradition of non-alignment within Brazil. And, again, here, we kind of have to think about Lula in contrast to his predecessor. Bolsonaro's foreign policy was really out of left field, by comparison to previous foreign policy in Brazil. There had been pretty strong continuity across all presidents of Brazil from the 1980s to the present. And all of a sudden, Bolsonaro came into office. He nominated somebody as foreign minister who was not very well known, not certainly a senior member of the foreign policy establishment, and represented a real break in terms of Brazilian foreign policy. Bolsonaro also went hardcore in aligning himself to Trump. And by that, I mean not the United States, but to President Trump, a very kind of personal alignment between the Bolsonaro family and the Trump family. And so in some ways, what we're seeing here is a return to a more professional, Itamaraty-driven foreign policy. And that's a foreign policy that for a generation now has been extremely committed to the belief that there is not much to be gained from subservience, and I use that word lightly, not in quotation marks, but there's not much to be gained by automatic subservience to the United States, that there's a lot to be gained by trying to play different players in the multipolar global environment, that the U.S. democratic agenda in some countries is nothing more than a front for U.S. national interests. The belief that Western countries pick and choose from the rules of the global liberal order in ways that benefit their interests at that particular moment in time. And I think perhaps most importantly, and this may explain some of the most egregious examples that you pointed out in your question, that preserving Brazilian sovereignty means backing the sovereignty of other countries, regardless of regime type, regardless of regime behavior. And you can agree or disagree with that perspective on foreign policy, but and I tend to disagree, but I think that the larger point here is that this is a tradition within Brazilian foreign policy that has been very strong and relatively constant over the past 40 years. And really the exception to that rule was the Bolsonaro administration. The Lula administration is reverting to a tendency that's been present there for much of the past 4 decades.
Marcio, what is your perspective on this? Does Lula see Brazil's future with the BRICS, and if so, how should we think about that?
I totally agree, Daniel, with what Mario said. I think he was very precise describing the Brazilian foreign policy. As a former member of the Brazilian agency that promotes foreign trade worldwide in Brazil, as a director of that agency, I can tell you that we had a really difficult shift during Bolsonaro's government. And I think it's very difficult for Americans to understand that. But I think that Mario put this in a very precise way, because many Americans thought that Bolsonaro was aligned to the United States, so that there was a connection between Brazil and the United States in the Bolsonaro's government. And it was not. It was a connection between Bolsonaro and the Trump family. So Bolsonaro likes autocrats. He doesn't like the countries. So it doesn't matter for him if a country is a democracy or not. It matters to him if he sees that guy as a leader, as an authoritarian leader, and if that guy is his friend, so he's aligned. So he was very friends with Viktor Orban in Hungary, and he would like some other places with autocrats like Belarus with Alexander Lukashenko. And so when Trump lost the election in the United States, Brazil was not a U.S. ally anymore. So he moved the Brazil to Russia, and he became friends with Putin. And then he traveled to Russia, he met Putin, and regardless of his connection with the United States. And since it was not a connection with the United States, it was a connection with Trump. And after Trump lost that election, even the foreign ministry that Matthew mentioned, he was fired from the government, and he was replaced with another foreign ministry that would justify the alignment with Russia because of fertilizers, and you can use any excuse, but the Brazilian was aligned during the beginning of the Ukraine war with Russia. And Putin said during the elections in Brazil that it didn't matter to him who would win the election in Brazil. He would have allies with Bolsonaro or with Lula. And really that happened because Brazil maintained the same international position for regarding the war in Ukraine, regarding Russia, regarding the US. So Brazil stayed away from the US. Brazil stayed close to Russia, even though Brazil doesn't say that the country supports Russia. And I think that for the US, Lula is much better than Bolsonaro because you know what to expect from this government. You know that the traditional Itamaraty people are running the Brazilian foreign policy, and you know what to expect from this government. So the US can prepare itself to what is coming. And with Bolsonaro, you didn't have that. Things would move around very quickly depending on who is in charge of the US government, who is in charge of the White House, and he would shift from Washington to Moscow really fast, and it would be really difficult to make predictions, investments on a long term, knowing that we had a president that was not trustworthy of his words, of what he was saying. He didn't have a clear policy where he was going. With Lula, we know that it's not a policy aligned to the US, okay? But we can deal with that. We know what is coming from there, where the Brazilian foreign policy is going, and then the international community, the Brazilian partners, Europe, the US, Canada, and any other country, they can predict where the Brazilian foreign policy is going. So that's what I see in our foreign policy today in Brazil.
Thank you. Lula has been critical of the European Union's environmental requirements for an EU-Mercosur agreement. And in recent remarks, he seemed inclined to pursue trade agreements with Canada and South Korea and others instead. Where do you see Brazil going on trade, Marcio?
Well, Brazil is always looking for its interests. So Lula now dealing with the European Union is being very vocal, saying that the European Union is looking for ways to avoid free trade agreement between Brazil and the European Union. But what we need to see, it's in a broader way, because I think he's playing cards in different levels. I think he is also dealing with the Ukraine issue, the Brazilian position in an international area, the BRICS, the relationship, the commercial relationship we have with China, that is very important right now because of commodities and agriculture in Brazil. So I think he is putting all the things aside and he's playing with the cards at the same time. We need to see that an European Union agreement is a very, very difficult to be put in place in Europe, because you need approval of every country legislative body. So it needs to go around more than 20 countries in order to be put in place. And in here, in South America, in Mercosur, we have different opinions from Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Uruguay wants to set up a free trade agreement with China. A right-wing government from Uruguay is dealing with that right now. And this also could affect the Mercosur and European Union deal. But I think that at the end, if every player puts some interests aside, I think we can find a way for an agreement. But it doesn't look to me now that we are finding this common ground. I think Lula is playing with different levels, different agreements, different countries, and the war. He has the need to be an international important person. He wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize, trying to find some common ground on Russia and Ukraine and end the war, like he tried to did in the past with Iran. So I think Lula is very away from where he should be, and he's stepping on some grounds that he doesn't know, and that can also bring very problems that are very important for our country, damaging the deals that we've been negotiating with other countries like the European Union.
This last question is for both of you, and I want to get your sense of where there are opportunities for closer bilateral cooperation between Brazil and the United States. And I'll just mention that a few of the areas that were outlined in I think last week by Brazil's ambassador to the United States. She mentioned fighting climate change and boosting the green economy, building supply chain resilience in several areas, and bilateral trade and investment flows. Matthew, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are interesting. The last two economic ones are difficult, but given that unfortunately, and I'm sure Marcio has a lot to say on this, but it seems to me that in many of the areas where our respective countries are predominant, they are in some ways very extreme competitors. So I'm thinking like Boeing versus Embraer. I'm thinking about sugar versus our corn producers. I think about there are a lot of areas where we are rivals as much as we can be cooperative on economic matters. And then, of course, there is a very different mindset about industrial policy in the two countries. And I know that, under the Biden administration, the U.S. has become much more industrial policy oriented, but it's still very different from Brazil when it comes to the type of government interventions that we're talking about. So in many ways, we're likely to see just as much competition there as we could cooperation. I also just want to kind of piggyback on what Marcio said a moment ago in his comments, but I think it's important to point out that official Washington was extremely, I'll use the Portuguese word, zangado. And the translation is hard to come by, but bothered, disappointed, because of all that they had done. Many senior officials here in Washington and senior officials on the ground in Brasilia went out of their way to ensure that the U.S. perspective on a democratic handoff of electoral power from Bolsonaro to Lula was made heard in Brasilia. And the fact that this was not, I think, appreciated by the Lula administration, or it was perceived as not having been appreciated by the Lula administration, I think has thrown a little bit of sand in the gears of what could have been an extremely promising administration to administration relationship between the Lula administration and the Biden administration. That being said, I think that alignment between these two countries on environmental issues and democracy is still possible, but it is a very narrow path because of the domestic politics in the two countries. And so, for example, on the Amazon, I think most of our listeners have a very clear sense of some of the sensitivities that Brazilians have to any perception of American intervention in the Amazon and in Amazon-related matters. And I think that extends over into many environmental issues that are not Amazon-related. And then I think in terms of democracy and democracy promotion, which would be another area where we might assume that there would be room for cooperation, unfortunately, one subset of democracy is accountability, anti-corruption, and I think that there's still a lot of sensitivity within the Brazilian political system to anything that could be done on that front. And so, these are very complex issues and somewhat hard to thread the needle. And where does that leave us? Well, I think, unfortunately, as I've said repeatedly over the 30 years that I've been studying Brazil, unfortunately, I think it leaves us with person-to-person diplomacy. And that's not the end of the world. It's better than not having any contact at all. But to expect really major cross-governmental collaboration is, I think, somewhat unrealistic. And what we've seen in the past is that ensures that the two governments really revert oftentimes to person, agency to agency level cooperation, not so much grand initiatives. But that can sometimes lead to very promising advances, whether it's the NASA boss being in Brasilia this week to talk about collaboration, sharing satellite imagery, suggesting partnerships, or on issues such as police-to-police collaboration on transnational organized crime groups that are proliferating in not just Brazil, but in many of the border regions of Brazil. I think that there is a lot of space for that kind of collaboration and cooperation. And so looking for small gains rather than kind of large impact initiatives is probably the more realistic way to go. But I'll turn it over to Marcio.
Thank you, Matthew. I think you covered all. I couldn't say much more about it. And I think that the cooperation between agencies is really important right now. We can see this possibility. And on the democracy side, anti-corruption, I do not see a lot of possibilities, because we had here a fight between the establishment, the corrupt establishment, against the car wash operation. And clearly who won that battle was the corruption establishment in the country overall. And now, just like in the Operação Mãos Limpas, as we call the Italian car wash operation during the 90s, we're seeing here the same thing. Now the establishment is going after the prosecutors, is going after the judges, is going after who investigate the corruption in Brazil. So it's a major change in the history of the country, the recent history of the country, where we've seen prosecutors and judges going after corrupt politicians in the past. Now the corrupt politicians are against the judges and the prosecutors. That's what we're seeing now as a reality in this country. So I do not see any room for a cooperation with the United States in anti-corruption, because this is not clearly in the Brazilian agenda right now. It was in the past, but it is not anymore. I see a really good possibility of cooperation in an environmental issues. That is something that this government says that is really important for him. And we have Marina Silva as the environmental minister, and I think she can make a difference dealing with the United States and the United States policy on climate change, for example. I think this is something that both countries could work together. And also clearly the personal relationships, like you said, Matthew, that also can make a difference. When I was in Congress in the past, after living in Washington for many years, building relations and friends in Washington, I was able to bring Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of former President Bolsonaro, to a trip to Washington to meet with politicians, senior official politicians in the U.S. government, Congress, senators, representatives, secretaries, and in the White House too, at that time, in order to create a bond between the new administration that was beginning in Brazil and the U.S. administration. So I think we can rely also on efforts from different people like me that in the past could also create connections that could make a difference in the bilateral relations between U.S. and Brazil. Like me, there are many people are able to do that who stayed in Washington for a long time, and Americans that are here in Brazil, former ambassadors that are able to do that connection between the two countries, and that I think that's really important in order to outline policies, to outline common ground, and to outline the possibility of a brighter future for both nations working together, because we know that Brazil and the US working together is something very important for the Americas, because we have much more common ground than things that separate us. We're both country of immigrants. We're like big countries in our continent, and working together, I think we can achieve a lot. And working one with the other, I think we can find solutions that are good for both countries. I see the US and Brazil as natural partners because of their history, because of their culture, because of their diversity. So I see the US and Brazil, if we make things right, as a good partnership that is equally good for both countries.
Those are great insights. Marcio and Matthew, thank you very much for what has been an informative discussion. To all those who have tuned in today, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.